So the meaning of life across life stage, across generation, across lifestyle comes down to the search for three things: truth, goodness, and beauty. Let's talk more about that today, midweek at the Compass. Welcome, Midweek at the Compass. My name is Jake. Great to have the chance to be with you again today. I am joined once again by my good friend and philosopher, theologian, all of these fun words that I don't really know what they mean. But I think I could definitively say you're my friend.
Thanks, Jake.
So that's what
I
I'm going to buy.
consider you a friend sometimes, too.
Hey, there you go. That's the best I'm going to get today, and I'm okay with it. But Gerald Aloran, thanks for being here again.
Hey, glad to be here. Glad to be with all of you watching this.
So last time we were together, we landed on, no matter what lifestyle, we talked about, the digital lifestyle, some other aspects of things. Go back week one, you're going to want to get the framework for how we landed where we did here. But we decided and we landed on the fact that all these philosophers across eons, it seems like, have landed on the fact that there is a search for truth, a search for goodness, and a search for beauty that gives meaning to life. But I don't think we can get any farther than that unless we start talking about what those things are, how we can maybe start to define what those are. So I'm just going to jump right in. Let's hit a heavy topic right off the bat. We talked about truth, and truth is a really interesting thing to define because I remember it like incredibly clearly. There was a clip of Oprah Winfrey maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, somewhere around there. And she specifically used the term your truth. You actually mentioned that same thing. You talked about my truth. So I want to just start right there. What is your truth or my truth versus truth? How do those tie together? What does that look like? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, if you're still watching and you're wondering, what in the world you said, my truth? I do want to say I do cringe at that term, my truth, but I use that to help people navigate through my understanding of the truth. But in actuality, truth, as seen throughout philosophical history, you'll see that people have looked at truth as something that exists apart from us, that exists and is always the same from when the beginning till the end. It's not malleable. It doesn't change. Truth is also something that's it's things that we observe, kind of like scientists. They're not creating anything new. They're just observing what's already in existence, what is true. And so, for example, when a scientist discovers a cure, all they're doing is discovering the cure. They're observing how it reacts to the physical body of a certain person that's dealing with a disease. They administer this plant, this drug, this chemical concoctions of different things. And if it cures these sets of people over a period of time, it's true that this particular drug helps this particular ailment. So all scientists, just like in philosophy, all they're doing is discovering the truth, but it always existed out there.
Interesting. Yeah, so I got to own the fact that I've never really loved the my truth kind of concept because part of it, like, I think I would buy off on it if we mean by it my life experience, what I have had happen to me, like factual things about the past. To me, that could be something that makes a little bit of sense that I would sign off on. But I have a really hard time just processing the fact that truth can be found inside myself because that just, I've always thought of truth is not quite that dynamic, that it doesn't change from you to me.
Yeah, and that's a hard part in our culture. Without going into deep philosophical history, you'll begin to see just this change of thought when philosophers, educators start to just attack this idea of truth that exists out there. And that's a scary thought, because if there is no truth just out there where we can discover it, that means there is no such thing as truth. But as you and I know, we're Christians, and truth being revealed comes from a person. and that person is Jesus Christ. And he made these claims in the Bible where he's saying, I am the truth, the way, and the life. This objective things that philosophers have observed throughout the millennias, in one sense, it's all radiating and it's all coming from Jesus.
Yeah, I love that, and I want to make sure that we don't blow past that too quickly. So I'm going to look at you for a second here. Truth is not a concept. Truth is a person, and that person is found in the person of Jesus Christ. And that's really an interesting thought, right? Like, I feel like a lot of times we have this idea that truth is just this abstract thing. It's this concept, but what you're telling me now from scientific evidence, from philosophical end, one, I love that we do that because the chemistry major scientist in me speaks to one end of things, and the philosophical end, I feel like skews into your wheelhouse a little bit. I think that's a podcast all on its own, the scientist and the philosopher. But anyways, besides that, truth isn't a concept. It's a person. Tell me a little bit more about that. How do we see that? What does we see play out in that?
Yeah. Since truth is not malleable, you can't twist it and turn it. Since you observe it and it's always existed before you were ever born and will probably exist until you pass, whatever truth of that is, gravity, it's always existed before I was born, right?
As far as you know.
As far as I know, right? Space, air, chemical elements, the chemical timetable, the chemical table,
the periodic
there
table.
You go,
of
the
elements.
periodic title. See, I'm not a scientist. See?
Hey, now.
All of those have always existed before I was born. I just learned it and discovered it. Now, if as Christians we hold to the fact that there is a God who created all things, that means truth emanates from this person, God, who revealed himself in Jesus. And therefore, this truth can be discovered. So here's the interesting thing about truth. If it can be discovered and it's in the person of Jesus, that means the only way we can actually fully know if it's revealed to us. And so theologically speaking, there's two ways. Here's my theology hat coming on right now.
I'm ready.
There's two ways that God reveals, right? One is a general way, a revelatory way. Theologians call this general revelation. This is the things in creation like space, air, trees, mountains, water, people, things we can observe. And those things, if you were to put it in terminology that we could understand, biology, geology, psychology, sociology, these things are observable. These are things that you can see and observe and make observations and conclude a certain truth based on these observations. But besides general revelation, theologians say the other way that God reveals is special revelation. And in this special revelation, God reveals himself specifically through Scripture, specifically through Jesus Christ, specifically throughout the history. And specifically means that these are things you can't just observe. These things have to be revealed. And so, yeah, there are things we can observe in nature, but also you need revelation, specific revelation, to understand concepts like truth.
I love that. So what we know about truth has been revealed. And you also said something that's incredibly interesting that I want to backtrack to just a quick second, of how truth has always existed. So if it's always existed, that means it's eternal. So you might be wondering, like, how in the world can we say that this person, Jesus, is truth when we also in the same breath say that truth has been the same forever and ever? It's found outside of ourselves. And for that, I want to go John 1, right? John is a gospel in the Bible, if you're unfamiliar, but in the very beginning, the prologue of this book, there's the discussion of, in the beginning was the Word. And we find out later in that chapter that the Word means Jesus. So since the beginning of time, before the foundation of anything, Jesus was already there. Then we fast forward to the end. I'm a big fan sometimes of skipping to the end. Hopefully you're not doing that with us today. But you fast forward to the end, we know that although Jesus died, he rose again, he ascended into heaven, he is seated at the right hand of God, preparing a place for us, all those kind of fun things that are just really heady and hard to understand. But the fact that truth is eternal and truth as a person still lines up when that person is Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And one thing interesting about this truth, Jesus, he says something when he's praying to the Father before he ultimately he dies for our sins, was buried, and rose again from the dead. He's praying this in John 17, and he's saying this to the Father in heaven: sanctify them in the truth, and your word is truth. And so Jesus, the person being truth, but also in the word that God is revealing to us in a special way, truth can be objectively found in there to us as well.
Dude, that's fantastic. We could probably talk about truth forever, but let's keep moving because there were two other concepts that I want to make sure that we get to here. So the second one is the meaning of life. The search for meaning can be found across the board in searching for goodness. So talk to me a little bit about that. Like, let's start unpacking what is goodness. How do we find what's good?
Yeah, good question, because good question. You like that?
But
if if truth is not observable, if truth is not discovered, if truth is something you make up within your own self, anything can be good. Anything. I could make some of the most horrific things in mankind's history good, because if there's no objective truth that we discover, then nothing really is technically good. So people who say my truth, they could also say, oh, I think that's good. But if there is objective truth, that means there has to be things that are objectively good. Things that are objectively good throughout Scripture is anything that God gives to us, anything from God himself, the air that we breathe, the things that we see, the families that we have. Every good thing comes from God. And so goodness is the truth revealed through Jesus, and what is given to us from him is good.
Okay, so there's a lot there. So let's start slightly at the beginning here, because it's another point that I just want to make sure that we land on for a couple of seconds. You and I are different. I don't know if you can tell. I have hair. Gerald doesn't. But you can grow a beard and I can't. So, it's a trade-off. But ultimately, if there is something that's objectively good, it's got to be the same for both of us. And we talked about it a couple of weeks ago on Midweek when we were talking about, does life have a purpose? Now we're talking about searching out the meaning. But ultimately, no matter what, if goodness is objective, it's got to be true for both of us. And there's a lot of things in life that could be good for me that just inherently are not going to be good for you. And quite frankly, vice versa. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of times we prefer it when life is good for us, whether that means it's at the detriment of somebody else or not. I think most of us would say we don't want it to be at the detriment of somebody else. But that's a very real thing. It's about our perception. But if goodness is beyond my feelings, if goodness is beyond what impacts me, that means it objectively has to come from somewhere, again, beyond me. So you've landed on.
Correct. And, I'm going to take off my philosophy and theologian hat. I'm going to put on my pastoral hat, which I am very comfortable in. And I think the hard part when I'm counseling people who've gone through tremendous trauma, it really is difficult at that moment, at that time. But hindsight always tells us, when we look back, I could look back at seasons of my life that was so difficult that at the time that I was dealing with the trauma, no way is this a good thing for a person like me to experience, right? This is horrible. How can I experience that? And I could look back 5 years later, and I could look back at that situation. I say, that was a really hard season, but man, it was really necessary and it was good for me. Thank you, Jesus. And so some of you watching this, you've probably experienced things that are so difficult, and you might be dealing with it right now, COVID, the loss of family members, whatever it may be. And it's a horrible situation to go through. But in the future, God will reveal things that you can look back and say, that was a hard season. That was so hard. That was so difficult. I never want to go through that again. But God is so good. God is so good.
been there, right? Like it's one of those, I think back to just the gut wrenching aspects of miscarriage is a really easy example that my wife and I had to delve into and deal with. And it's hard to sit there and think like I would ever want to relive those days and those times. But I can also now, in hindsight, almost a decade later, and sit down and say, in the midst of garbage, God was still good. He was still with me, next to me, supporting, caring. That was shown through people and circumstances and the truth of his word, Jesus. So yeah, I would fully buy off on that even in the midst of not good situations, there can still be an objective goodness that we can discover, maybe not in real time, but when you sit down and ponder after the fact, you can start to piece all those things together. And just kind of one last thought on goodness, right? Like, if truth is Jesus and goodness is revealed through God, Jesus actually says as much, because people go up to him and it's like, hey, good teacher, what's up? And he looks at him and is like, no, you've got this wrong. No one is good except my Father, which is just additional reiteration, support, if you will, if you want to go that route of Jesus is truth. Goodness comes from God because he loves us enough to reveal that truth to us. Sweet. All right, man. Let's hit number 3, beauty. So beauty's an interesting one, right? Like, we sit there and talk about it. Beauty seems like it's a very objective, skin deep kind of conversation, that it's all just about facade, appearance, all those kind of things. But if we're all searching out beauty, and beauty, changes over the course of history, what people find to be attractive shifts and changes, then let's talk a little bit, right? Like, what is beauty? How can we search out meaning through beauty?
Yeah. And so I'm going to read a verse from Psalm 27, verse 4 and verse 13. This is one thing I have asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Once again, we're beginning to see a trend. All good things come from God because he's true. But the way we experience that goodness, from the joy of finding out that I'm having another kid. For example, I'm not having another kid, by the way, just to let you know.
Not breaking news here.
Good,
yeah.
Not breaking news. That joy, the experience of birth, if you've experienced that when you're in the room, that's good from God. That's goodness from God. And when you experience that goodness, it's so beautiful to you that you react in emotion. And so I want to say truth emanates from God. All good things come from God. And the way we respond and react is the idea of beauty. We look upon such beautiful things because it's good. We look at mountains and it does something to us emotionally in a positive way. We look at art that people have created over the centuries. As we look at these things, we notice the colors and the strokes and the way it portrays feelings. These are good things, and the way we react to it, that's the beauty aspect of this whole thing.
So just to make sure that I'm clear, are you saying that beauty is a reaction to goodness and truth?
Yeah, so beauty is objectively, it exists, but the subjective component is a reaction to the goodness of God. And it's played out in so many situations, like I just mentioned before.
Yeah, so I can't think of a time where I've seen mountains and not thought, yeah, those are beautiful. Go to a nature preserve, all those things. So the search for beauty should ultimately then reflect back to the person of Jesus and the goodness of God, and then all of that causes a reaction within us to ultimately lead us back to a maker, right? I think beauty a lot of times goes back to a term that you brought up earlier, general revelation. I'm going to blank on the specific reference on the spot because we didn't talk about this beforehand, but Romans 1, I want to say, where like the heavens declare the glory of God. Like you can't look around creation and not know that there's a God because of the beauty of what's around us and what he's revealed and shown.
Yeah, and just to further that, sometimes beautiful things, they do exist, but we just don't notice it, right? These things are so beautiful, and until you kind of just step in and observe and slow down our fast-paced lives, I've never noticed that. That is really beautiful. Before moving to the Chicago suburbs, we were living out in the cornfields. And
I got to say, I love that cornfield.
Yeah.
Born and raised as well. So it's good news. Yeah.
And living in that area for 10 years, there's a lot of things that I miss. It's quiet. Before I used to hate it coming from the city, and then living there 10 years, coming out here in the suburbs, I'm like, oh, that quiet was beautiful. When I looked up into the sky, I just look at the stars because there's not a lot of noise pollution or light pollution or electrical pollution, that you could look up and see the stars so bright. Those things I took for granted when I lived there. It was always beautiful, but now I'm here. It's even more beautiful now to me, right? It's just amazing the things that we take for granted. And that's why these verses that I've read, it's like when you gaze upon the Lord, you observe and you see the beauty of his goodness. It's amazing.
So just a personal tangent here. My oldest daughter loves going outside and looking at stars. She's excited to be studying space, but she'll step outside our house in Naperville, Illinois, like the heart of suburbia, and like just gets thrilled when she sees the 3 stars of Orion's belt. Dad, there are stars. And I'm sitting here like, man, I have failed you. We have got to get away from here for a little bit on a nice clear night, just so you can go up and be like, there's more to it than this. But that's also a good reminder, right? Like we can see beauty, but there's also the reminder, get outside of your current circumstances. There is so much more beauty that you can see and interact with that's just there and waiting for you. Get outside of what you're dealing with. Give yourself space and time to reflect differently, to look at things differently, and you're going to see more beauty and in a whole new light than you ever thought would be imaginable. So there you go. The search for meaning across generations, truth, goodness, and beauty. So now that we kind of landed on everybody's looking for a meaning in life, the meaning of life can be found kind of in these 3 things, and we started to flesh out what these 3 things are. I think the next question is ultimately going to have to be, what's the path, right? How do we get from point A to point B as we're searching for meaning? Once we start to discover that there's truth and goodness and beauty, what does it look like? What are the life stages of somebody who's walking through and having these things revealed and reflecting and putting thought into? And from the Christian perspective here, people that have put faith in Jesus, what does it look like to be living these things out? So we're going to get to that next week. Thank you for being with us here today. Thank you for taking a few moments. I'm really excited to wrap up our conversation. Look forward to having you back with us here real soon, midweek at the Compass.